Oyster shells into Charlotte Harbor today to help boost water quality and help our fish and anglers. The shells act as a natural filter to get toxins out of the ecosystem.
Imagine more than 500,000 tons of oyster shells being dumped into the ocean. These were not specially designed structures. They were the same shells removed from restaurant plates, taken from seafood factories, loaded onto boats, and carried out to sea. Between 2007 and 2024, that is exactly what happened in Florida. But the question was, what could possibly be gained by putting waste into the ocean? Many people thought it would only cause damage. There were environmental concerns. Fishermen feared that their old fishing areas would be damaged, and critics even called it dumping garbage into the ocean in the name of conservation. Then, about 18 months later, scientists returned to those same locations. They expected that the shells might have been buried under sediment and that not much would have changed. But what they saw there changed the way they thought about it. The part of the seafloor where there had once been only soft sand was slowly changing. Life was returning, and much faster than expected. But the real question was still left. What exactly had these useless shells done? To find out the answer, stay until the end of the video, because the most surprising part of the story is still yet to come. Before we move ahead in the video, please subscribe to the channel so you can watch videos like this first. There was a time when Florida's Gulf Coast was home to large natural oyster reefs. From above, they might have looked like nothing more than piles of oysters, but in reality, an entire marine life was living around them. Small fish had places to hide. Many marine animals had food and safe shelter, and the oysters themselves continued to grow on these reefs generation after generation. A healthy oyster reef can provide habitat for around 300 different species. But the most special thing about these reefs was that humans did not need to do something new every time to build them. Nature kept building them on its own. When an oyster died, its shell remained on the sea floor. Then oyster larvae drifting through the water, also called spat, looked for a hard place where they could attach. If they found an old oyster shell, they settled there, slowly grew, and one day began leaving new shells themselves. In this way, an old shell became a home for the next generation. So, the reef was actually being built by the reef itself. One generation left a foundation for the next generation. But slowly, conditions began to change along Florida's coastal areas. There was too much harvesting of oysters, pollution in the water increased, and construction around the coast continued to spread. Old oyster beds became fewer, and with them, the strong foundation on which the new generation needed to settle also disappeared. Now the problem was a little strange. Oyster larvae were still present in the ocean, but they had nowhere to land. They drifted with the water and reached soft sand, but they could not stay there. The result was that there were fewer new oysters, fewer new shells, and even less hard surface for the next generation. In other words, a cycle had already been broken. No foundation, no settlement. No settlement, no new oysters. And no new oysters, no new shells for the next generation. The problem was not that there were no oyster larvae in the Gulf. The problem was that they had nowhere to land. And that is where an idea came up that sounded more like garbage disposal in the ocean than a conservation project. Now the question was how to restart that broken cycle. And this is where an experiment began in Florida that at first might sound more like throwing garbage into the ocean than conservation. Between 2007 and 2024, the Florida Fish and Wildlife Conservation Commission ran a major oyster restoration program. Under this program, discarded oyster shells were collected from different restaurants and seafood processing facilities across Florida. These were not specially prepared shells. They included shells scraped off people's plates and shells left over as waste after being used in seafood factories. They were collected in trucks, then loaded onto boats and deposited at designated locations around Cedar Key in the Gulf of Mexico. In total, we are talking about more than 500,000 tons of oyster shells. Think about it, the decision to put such a huge amount into the ocean was a big one. And obviously, there was opposition. Some environmental groups were worried that putting these shells into the ocean could bury organisms already living there and disturb the natural balance of the sea floor. Many people started calling it simply ocean dumping, Local fishermen were also concerned. Their families had been fishing these waters for generations. They were worried that the large piles of shells could change water currents, cause sediment to build up, and damage the fishing grounds their livelihoods depended on. And the most interesting thing was that even scientists were not claiming that the experiment would definitely succeed. The Commission's reasoning was simple. These shells were going to end up in landfills anyway. If they were put into the ocean and given a chance to become oyster reefs, maybe this waste material could actually be useful. In the worst case, only the location of the waste would change. But if everything went as hoped, this same waste could give the Gulf the hard surface it needed. But the real surprise was not that the shells did something. The real surprise was how quickly they did it. The real test was about to begin. About 18 months after the oyster shells were placed in the ocean, monitoring teams returned to the same locations. Scientists were not expecting much. They thought most of the shells might have already been buried under sediment. A few small marine organisms might be visible there, but it would still take many years for a real reef to form. In other words, they were not expecting any major change. But as soon as they started looking at the seafloor, the picture was a little different. Marine life was quickly appearing on and between the shells. Where there should have been nothing more than a pile of discarded shells, biological activity had already begun. Different kinds of small organisms were settling on those surfaces, and it looked like the whole area was slowly changing. For Dr. Krimsky, an oyster habitat specialist associated with the Florida Fish and Wildlife Conservation Commission, these results were also far beyond expectations. During a monitoring briefing, the numbers coming in forced the team to stop and think again. Because normal artificial reefs can often take years to show biological signs and move toward becoming a complex ecosystem. Here, changes were becoming visible within months. But the most interesting thing was that, from above, there might not have been any huge miracle to see. The same dull-colored shells were still lying on the seafloor. No giant reef had suddenly appeared. If an ordinary person had passed by, they might have thought that nothing special had happened. But the scientists took water samples and collected cores from inside the sediment, and those samples told a completely different story. The ocean looked calm from above, but underneath, something had already started forming that could not be seen with the naked eye. That was the biggest mystery of this whole story. How were these dead shells starting a new ecosystem in such a short time? And then researchers saw the thing that was the most important layer of this entire story. A world that no diver could even see with their own eyes. Until now, what had happened was not really happening on the ocean's surface. Its real secret was hidden far below it. And the most interesting part was that it did not start with fish. Even oysters were not the first to arrive. The first ones were bacteria. When the oyster shells settled on the seafloor, tiny microorganisms began gathering on their surfaces. They were so small that it was difficult to see them without a microscope. Slowly, they began forming a thin biological layer across the surface of the shells, called a biofilm. Now these shells were no longer just dead shells lying in the ocean. Their surfaces were turning into a tiny microscopic habitat. After that, diatoms and microscopic algae began to appear. They made the biofilm a food base for even more organisms. Then small crustaceans arrived. Larval mollusks arrived, and other small grazing organisms also began gathering there. And these tiny organisms became food for the larger life that would come later. Think of it like a building being constructed. First, the foundation is built, then the walls come, and after that, the upper floors are built. Something similar was happening here. Shell to bacteria, to biofilm, to algae, to small organisms, to juvenile organisms, to fish. But there was another interesting part of the story. The oyster shells were not just providing a hard surface to attach to, they were also slightly changing the water's chemistry. These shells are mainly made of calcium carbonate. When they come into contact with seawater, some of their material slowly dissolves and releases calcium ions. This can create a very small-scale chemical environment around the shells that may make settlement and growth easier for some organisms that need calcium. So these shells were not just providing a surface, they were providing both surface and chemistry. Now the microscopic foundation of the reef was ready. But the next question was even bigger. Would the real oysters come back now? By now, a foundation had been prepared on the seafloor where something bigger could grow, but the real test was about to begin. Would oyster larvae actually come and settle on these new shell deposits? Oyster larvae, also called spat, keep drifting with the water. During a specific stage of their life, they need to find a place where they can firmly attach. If they land on soft sand, it becomes quite difficult for them to stay and grow. But now the picture was different. Oyster shells were lying across the seafloor in different places. These shells were working like landing pads for them. The larvae drifting through the water reached these areas, and for the first time, they were finding a hard surface where they could settle. Researcher Dr. Bill Pine and his team saw that far more juvenile oysters were settling on these shell deposits than expected. And this is where the story took a real turn. The small oysters that had first attached themselves to these shells slowly grew. Then they became adults and started releasing new larvae into the water themselves. Now the cycle was complete. Adult oysters to new larvae to settlement on shells to new oysters. But another cycle was also happening. When these oysters died, their shells remained there and created a new hard surface for the next generation. Old oyster to new shell to new place to next generation. By the third year, some of the deposited shell areas recorded an average of 847 oysters per cubic meter. In the nearby soft bottom areas of the seafloor, there were almost no oysters compared to this. The water was the same. The currents were the same. The larvae were also the same. The only difference was that here, they had a strong surface to settle on. This is where the work of humans slowly began to end. Humans had only put the shells there in the beginning. After that, nature started handling the work itself. But if the reef was really coming back, its effect was not going to be limited to oysters. Soon, something else was going to arrive in the ocean, and this time, you would not need a microscope to see it. By now, a small ecosystem had formed underneath the oyster reef, but its effect became clearly visible for the first time when bigger fish started arriving there. In 2013, charter captain Mike Lent was quite concerned about these reefs. His family had been fishing in these waters for many generations. He was worried that these piles of shells would damage their old fishing grounds. But one day, he saw something near the reef site that changed his thinking. A large group of redfish was gathered around a big shell reef. The fish were not just passing through. They were continuously moving around the reef and using its different areas. Mike Lent finally admitted, "I was wrong." And there was a reason behind it. A sandy seafloor does not offer much to fish, but a complex reef gives them places to hide, places to ambush prey, and small surfaces where they can find food. Especially for juvenile fish, these places are extremely useful because they get a safe spot to stay away from bigger fish. Surveys recorded an increase of more than 340% in fish biomass around the reef sites. Species diversity also increased by up to 280%. But the most important thing was not just the number of fish. The presence of juvenile fish showed that these reefs were not simply gathering fish that were already there. They were giving young fish a chance to survive, grow, and eventually become adults. Redfish were hiding in the complex cracks of the reef. Sheepshead were eating small organisms found on the hard surfaces. Flounder were using the edges of the reef, and snook also started appearing in these new habitats. Slowly, the thinking of fishermen also began to change. The same people who had opposed these reefs earlier later started asking for new reef sites. But now, researchers had another big question. Were these reefs only giving wildlife a home, or were they also changing the water across the Gulf? By now, it was clear that oyster reefs were giving fish and other marine animals a place to live. But oysters had another job, and it was perhaps even more interesting: cleaning the water. An adult oyster can filter around 30 to 50 gallons of water every day. For one oyster, that number may seem small, but when millions of oysters are present on a reef, the number suddenly becomes huge. Together, the whole reef can process billions of gallons of seawater every day. Oysters filter suspended particles and some excess nutrients from the water. And for the Gulf Coast, this job is extremely important. Because runoff from farms and cities carries nutrients like nitrogen and phosphorus into the sea. Too many nutrients can sometimes encourage harmful algal blooms. The water becomes murky, oxygen levels can drop, and sometimes large numbers of fish can die. But where oyster reefs started developing again, the picture slowly began to change. Water clarity started improving. Nutrient concentrations went down, and dissolved oxygen levels also showed improvement. And the benefit was not limited to just the area around the reef. As the water became clearer, more sunlight could reach deeper into the water. This gave seagrass a chance to grow again. Then the seagrass started holding the seafloor sediment more firmly, which reduced the amount of sediment getting stirred up in the water and made the water even clearer. So, a new cycle started. Clearer water leads to more sunlight, leads to more seagrass, leads to less sediment, leads to even clearer water. In this way, the reef was not just making one place better for living things, but was slowly making the whole surrounding coastal system stronger. According to researchers' estimates, the economic value of the filtration service provided by these reefs could reach tens of millions of dollars. But cleaning the water and giving fish a home was still just the beginning. The real surprise came when a monster storm put these reefs to the test. In September 2017, a storm hit the Florida coast that tested the real strength of these reefs without any warning. Its name was Hurricane Irma. It was a Category 4 storm, and its winds reached more than 150 miles per hour. Along the coast, storm surge came with the powerful winds, and beaches were badly eroded in many places. But there was one interesting thing about this whole story. No one had built these oyster reefs for storm protection. Still, after the storm passed, when scientists and officials looked at the coastline, they saw a clear difference. Where the reef was present, the shoreline behind it was much better protected compared with nearby areas where there was no such reef. Some estimates found that erosion in reef-protected areas was around 30 to 40% lower. So why did this happen? The answer was hidden in the structure of the reef. It was not a smooth wall. It had layers of thousands of oysters, small and large gaps, and a rough, three-dimensional surface. When powerful waves hit this complex structure, their energy could not reach the shore all at once. The reef broke up and spread that energy. As a result, the shoreline behind it experienced less impact from the waves, and then came a surprising number. It was estimated that during Hurricane Irma alone, these reefs helped prevent around $3 million in potential damage. The entire 15-year restoration program had cost around $5 million. So, a single major storm showed the economic value of this project in a completely new way. Seawalls and concrete barriers become weaker and break down over time. They need repair and maintenance. But a living oyster reef works differently. A seawall gets weaker over time, but a living reef can grow over time. Now the question was this reef only becoming stronger, or could it also spread and become even bigger? By now, the story had reached another big turning point. The question was not just whether the oyster reefs had come back. The question was, would they now need constant help from humans? By the beginning of the 2020s, the data was starting to answer that question. The area of the oldest reef sites had become almost twice as large compared to the original shell deposits. And the most important thing was that they did not need new shells to be added again and again for this expansion. The reef was growing on its own. The whole system was quite simple. An oyster settles on the old reef. It grows, becomes an adult, and then releases new larvae into the water. The new generation settles on the same reef. Over time, some oysters die, and their shells remain there. And those old shells again become a hard surface for the next generation. So the whole cycle looked something like this. Oyster to shell, to new surface, to new oyster, to more shell, to bigger reef. Because of this, the reef was not only growing upward, but also spreading outward. In the beginning, these places looked like loose piles of shells. But years later, their structure had changed completely. There were taller structures in some places, small cavities in others, overhangs in some areas, and connected surfaces in others. And different animals were using these different spaces. Crabs were hiding in the cracks. Octopus were finding safe places. Sea stars were moving across the surfaces, and juvenile fish were taking shelter in small cavities. So by now, calling it just a shell pile was no longer right. It had slowly become a living ecosystem architecture that was creating new space for itself. Humans had only provided a starting point. The reef's own biological cycle was doing the rest. But as scientists continued watching these reefs for longer periods, they noticed another benefit. A benefit that perhaps hardly anyone had thought about in the beginning: carbon. By now, these oyster reefs were giving fish a home, cleaning the water and helping protect the shoreline from storms. But over time, researchers started seeing another interesting direction: carbon. Oyster shells themselves are made of calcium carbonate, and organic carbon can also build up in the sediments around the reef. Because of this, oyster restoration is now being looked at not only from the point of habitat recovery, but also together with climate adaptation and carbon management. However, research in this area is still developing, so it would not be right to call it some kind of magical climate solution. But this whole story did bring forward one very big idea: circular environmental design. In simple language, it means that something we consider waste and throw away can be used somewhere else as environmental infrastructure. Here, discarded oyster shells were used as the foundation of a reef. Similar ideas were used when Alabama started an oyster recycling program in 2015. Mississippi and Louisiana also moved forward with oyster restoration. In New York Harbor, the Billion Oyster Project connected oyster reefs with urban waterway restoration. And slowly, interest in nature-based coastal solutions also grew in other countries: Canada, Australia, and Europe. But there is one important difference to understand here. Sinking an old ship into the sea or putting concrete reef balls in the water can bring fish together in one place. But fish aggregation and fish production are not the same thing. With an oyster reef, the situation is different. There is reproduction, filtration, new habitat is being created, new substrate is being prepared from new shells, and coastal protection is also provided. So, several natural cycles were working together in the same system. Now the question was, if humans had started it, would this system always need humans? In 2007, when this whole project started, everything was in human hands. People decided where the shells had to be placed, collected them, loaded them onto boats, took them out to sea, and placed them in different locations. So, the beginning was completely done by humans. But by the 2020s, the picture had changed quite a lot. Now, humans did not need to add shells separately for every new generation. Oysters were coming to the old reef on their own, growing there and then producing new larvae. Some oysters died, their shells stayed there, and those same shells became a new hard surface for the next generation. Because of this, the reef slowly kept growing on its own. And, as the reef became bigger, its benefits also increased. More oysters leads to more shells, leads to bigger reef leads, to more habitat leads to more marine life, leads to more oysters. In other words, a cycle had started that did not need humans to step in every time. Along with this, the second cycle of cleaning the water also became stronger. More oysters leads to more filtration, leads to cleaner water, leads to more seagrass leads to healthier ecosystem leads to better conditions for oysters. And there was a third benefit too. As the reef became bigger and denser, it started blocking more of the energy from the waves. This could reduce erosion along the shoreline and help keep the coast more stable. Bigger reef leads to less wave energy, leads to less erosion, leads to more stable shoreline. This was the biggest change in the whole story. In 2007, people were saying, "Why are they dumping waste into the ocean?" But a few years later, those same shells had turned into a living ecological infrastructure that was growing on its own, creating new habitat and continuously increasing its benefits. Humans had only started it. Now the reef was doing its own work. But the biggest lesson from this story is not about just one reef in Florida. So, let's look back at the whole story once. It started with things people considered useless and threw away. Oyster shells. Those shells reached the ocean, And then those same shells became a hard surface. Microbes and algae came to that surface. Then oysters returned, and slowly, fish started coming too. So the story became something like this. Waste to shells to new surface, to oysters, to fish to cleaner water, to seagrass, to storm protection to bigger reef. And if we remember the early days, the picture was completely different. People were afraid that this was just like dumping waste into the ocean. Fishermen were worried that their fishing grounds would be damaged, and many people thought the experiment might fail. But later, data changed the story. Some sites recorded around 847 oysters per cubic meter. Fish biomass in reef areas increased by more than 340%, and species diversity increased by up to 280%. After Hurricane Irma, erosion in some reef-protected areas was around 30 to 40% lower, with an estimated $3 million in avoided damage. But this story does not mean that we should pick up any kind of waste and dump it into the ocean. The real point is much more sensible. The right material, the right place, the right ecosystem, and the right biological process can turn waste into ecological infrastructure. Humans did not build the reef. They simply brought back the missing thing that was needed to get started: a hard surface. The rest was done by bacteria, algae, oysters, fish, tides, and the generations that came after them. Maybe the strangest part is that nature needed very little from humans to create such a big change. Just a place to start. Now the question is for you. If sometimes all the ocean needs to bring life back is